This question is for Elspeth. In some of your earlier work, such as your 2021 Putting Indian Country on the Map, Indigenous Practices of Spatial Justice article, you look into indigenous feminist spatial practices that disrupt colonial relations of power that mapping and countermapping often reinforce. Can you talk about how countermapping, often associated with breaking power relations, might reinforce colonial relations of power? And for folks who might not have yet read this article, do you recall what some of the indigenous feminist spatial practices were that were used to challenge colonial legacies?
Thanks. Yeah, so this paper that you're referencing is the paper I wrote about the Zuni, in large part is about the Zuni Map Art project, and thinks about how do these Zuni practices of spatial representation both kind of challenge kind of normative representations that we might see in things like Google Maps. But how do they also assert kind of Zuni space in place to a variety of audiences? So it's, I think there's kind of, I think maybe underdeveloped in the paper, but one thing I think about a lot is kind of how we think about countermapping. And often if someone says, I'm gonna start this countermapping project, often they're like, okay, I need to learn GIS. And then I need to, develop this kind of, a series of maps that show what I wanna show. But I think often in doing that, we end up reifying those exact same kind of Western conventions of mapping that are sometimes in contradiction to indigenous practices of spatial representation. So in that paper, I talk about the Zuni Map Art project, which is two-dimensional paintings. And then I also talk about a performance. I talk about it as kind of performance cartography, though I think the activists who did this saw themselves as like protesters, but there was a proposed coal mine that was not technically on federally recognized Zuni territory, but it is part of kind of Zuni's geography. And working with a bunch of environmental organizations, a group from Zuni Pueblo did a running protest from Zuni Pueblo to Phoenix, Arizona, which is about, like, if you're driving in a car, that's like 6 hours maybe. And so people ran around the headquarters of the company that was going to, the mining company. And then they also had a moving billboard that was put on the back of a truck, and they drove that kind of all through the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah. And so I think about this as kind of a visual way of making a spatial claim that isn't confined to kind of these Western cartographic norms. And so I want to think about, like, how does this represent Zuni territory differently? And so I think what both the Zuni Map Art project and this running protest did was show Zuni territory as this much more expansive inhabited place than any map of legally recognized territory has done.
I'm going to ask a slightly different question here. And I think it's really, really good, and I'm curious to hear both of your answers. This is definitely for both of you. Often questions in panels focused on Native and Indigenous or even just DI scholarship can focus on the violence and extractive past, but in an attempt to bring joy to these conversations, can you elaborate on some projects or work you're doing or have seen that excite you and bring you joy to your respective communities?
Yeah, and I think this is actually at the heart of carceral geographies, right? The dialectic between the violence and dispossession and kind of, premature death that they impose and enforce, and then the ways that people are taking pieces and putting them back together and trying to rebuild and are living, right? And are finding ways to thrive and reconnecting with each other, reconnecting with the earth. And I think something really important that Malama Makua, the group that I work really closely with, that Sparky is a leader of, something they always say, and that's the title of the book chapter, is listen to Makua, right? And another thing that they always say is, we're not in charge, the military is not in charge, Makua is in charge, right? So there's always that power and the agency of the earth that is persisting no matter how much we may poison it and bomb it and destroy it, or not we, but human beings and institutions like the U.S. military and, settler colonial powers. And then there's always the power of the earth that people are drawing from and reconnecting with and reformulating relations and social structures in relation with, right? So I think that dialectic really needs to be paid attention to, and that when we only talk about settler colonialism as this process of, elimination and replacement of, settlers with indigenous people, we're neglecting the ways that indigenous people are continuing to connect with the earth and draw power from the earth, and also just the way that human beings are finding ways of relating to each other amid these really violent structures.
I really like this question. I think a lot of scholars working in kind of like marginalized communities will start off a project where they're writing about violence and grief and destruction, and then think like, this is not life-giving, and how can I embody sort of the hope and liberatory practice that I'm writing about in my work? And I feel like I've kind of thought about that. This project originally started thinking about kind of counterinsurgent surveillance and how it has become normalized in our everyday lives, and that's still a part of it, but I think I'm much more interested in how Indigenous peoples are representing their territories in ways that are much more life-giving and liberatory. But I want to say something for a minute about another project I'm working on with an Lota Naga anthropologist, Dali Kikon, who is at UC Santa Cruz now. And we have been thinking about both of us have worked within kind of the critical development studies frame within our communities in Nagaland. And, but it feels very grim, and we kind of repeat our arguments repeatedly. And so we were thinking, like, what are some like Naga pedagogical ways of thinking about development and growth? And so we've been working on this project that we're calling Indigenous Pedagogies of Love. And in it, we think both about kind of our childhood experiences of learning about how Nagas think about relation and how we measure kind of the growth of communities. And so we're drawing both on kind of like childhood rhymes and ways of measuring things with your hands, and thinking about kind of the relations between parts of the earth. And then also drawing on our kind of fieldwork in more like development studies. And so I write in this project about in the Angami Naga tribe, there are there's many rice varieties in Nagaland, like over 800 have been documented, and different communities, rely more or less on certain varieties, and every variety has a story attached to it. And so I write about a variety of rice called love rice, like kekrilha is the word. And there's multiple stories attached to this. So some people say that love rice it represents sort of the feeling that you have for someone when you give them the rice. Some people have a story about a couple who were from different villages and fell in love, and so one person in the couple gave this rice variety to the person they loved as a token of connection between the two communities. And then other people say that the name kekrilha means like the feeling that you have when you eat it that emanates through your whole body. So I think that I'm really interested now in thinking about these kind of aspects of our cultural experience and our growing up that really can kind of shift the way we think about these kind of more issues of development and growth and colonialism, but are approaching them from a different angle without centering the colonialism and the violence there.
Thank you both for that. Yeah, I think that's great. It can be very, it's very important that we talk about the violence and centering it there, but also, we got to get through the day. We got to get through our session. So focusing on a bit of the joy and how we're creating that in our communities.
Fantastic talks. So one of the things that I've been kind of curious about is what concepts from these indigenous cultures that are still living, that are still very much inhabiting these spaces, can we apply to concepts of like civic space versus public space, and kind of how those things might be different, or like are there other concepts kind of in these communities that give that it's a shared space, but also not necessarily a space that can just be inhabited for whatever people are right. It's not an unlimited space, if that makes sense.
So when you're asking this question, I immediately thought of the native lands map, native-land.ca, I think is the website. And this map depicts indigenous territories globally, though it's not fully fleshed out. You can add or you can submit contributions to be added, and it's more. There's more coverage within North and South America on the map compared to the rest of the globe. But this shows like indigenous territories that are overlapping, and so each territorial space is a translucent shape. So that you can see where there are overlaps, and they don't really go into great detail explaining that. But I think like that, to me, that is sort of a visual representation maybe of some of these like shared common public spaces on a bigger scale that overlap and maybe sometimes are contested, but also sometimes are not at all. And I think in terms of maybe like recent politics, if we think about like Bears Ears National Monument, that exists because multiple tribal nations collaborated and said this is all of our historical space, and so they worked together to make that kind of conservation happen. But it wasn't about delineating whose piece is which.
I think I'll pick up on your thread, Elspeth, about contested spaces, and I'm thinking about the fishing grounds that one of my later chapters talks about that's fenced off, and it's state land. And what I see in that particular area is that the state is mimicking kind of these militarized infrastructures by putting up fences, but then they're saying this is conservation lands, so that the birds, like Laysan albatrosses in particular, are protected from predators. It creates more protection from off-roaders who, might be tearing up the land with their vehicles, but at the same time, in building this kind of, I don't know if we would call it a public space, but a protected space, they failed to consult with the Levaya, the fishers who have been fishing there for generations, who kind of have the most at stake in the environmental protection of that land, and the competing visions of environmentalism, about kind of fencing things off, and that people and species need to be tightly regulated and controlled, versus how do we protect the land by bringing in the people who have the most intimate relationships and seeing human activity as a basis of conservation, right? Not an impediment to conservation. So I think no matter what, these civic spaces or public spaces are going to be contested, particularly when it comes to visions of ecology and how the relations are working with each other.
Cartographic representations as grief. That's what Poisoned, I think, actually was. I don't know if you ever got a chance to speak with the filmmaker. Not about Okay, yeah, because that's what I was wondering about, because I'm familiar with his work. Not that particular work, but I don't know if you've ever seen anything else like that was a expression of grief or mourning, or if you have either.
Yeah, I think absolutely you can have cartographic expressions of grief, and I can see that Poison can function in that way. I think that especially at the end of Poisoned, I think it's a nod to thinking beyond the grief and thinking about action inspired by the grief. But yeah, I think that's absolutely there. And I'm trying to think. I'll think about some other. I'll take that question and think about other examples of cartographies of grief.
I see the garden, Papawai'ola on Makua Beach, as an expression of grief, and that was my distinct sense when I spoke to Leandro 20 years ago and I met her on the beach, and it was a way of working through her grief, and that was my impression also, the grief of militarism, but the grief of losing her home on the beach and being forcefully evicted. And I see that as a way of reshaping the surface of the earth. So I haven't quite thought about things in terms of cartography, but I'm definitely interested to hear your perspectives. But I think it's a way that she is kind of not just representing land as we saw in her journals, but using that as a way to reshape the Earth's surface.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you about organized abandonment and your use of that term in like the colonial context in Hawaii. I've been interested in using that concept for the Mariana Islands and also the U.S. military presence out there. I would just love to hear you kind of unpack how you use it.
Thank you. It's a really tricky term that I've spent years and years and years trying to work out. And what I've arrived at, and I'm sure it will develop and evolve, is that it's layered abandonment. And so the kind of primary rupture of organized abandonment is that rupture between humans and life-giving resources, right? Because that is a form of care, mutual care and relationships where people, particularly Indigenous people, but all humankind has been able to survive outside of market relations for generations and generations, right? Through relationships with the earth and drawing from that as a life-giving resource. So when that rupture is created, there's this withdrawal or this abandonment or neglect of relations with the earth as a life-giving resource. And then layered on top of that are more and more layers of abandonment. And I think organized abandonment, I would trace it to kind of the neoliberal era of the withdrawal of social safety nets and public infrastructure. So then that's layered on top of this ruptured human environment interdependence. And then with the increased skyrocketing cost of housing and housing crises of recent decades, that create so it's just like they're all piled on top of each other and together. And then the rise of the carceral state, where resources are going to policing and prisons, particularly of houseless communities, instead of to services and affordable housing. And then the money going to the over half of the federal budget going to the U.S. military versus social programs. All of that together constitutes organized abandonment.
Hi, thank you both for speaking. This has been awesome. I am curious, thinking about the topic of representation, not only on maps, but also in like textual-based narratives, when and in what ways is it appropriate to kind of unify the experience of Indigenous American communities without losing the nuance in specific different experiences that groups have had in different places within North America?
This is a big question. And I do work in kind of like Indigenous internationalism. And so then I feel like I immediately jump to that scale. And I think this is a question of scale. And so I think there are, I think the specific and place-based experiences of an individual community actually play a big part in how we think about these kind of having more unified conversations and thinking about kind of like continental experiences. And I think that the hard part, like the big challenge across Indigenous studies, is balancing that the place-based and the specific with the kind of more, I think, transnational. And I think even within, if we're talking about like tribes that are federally recognized by the United States, I think we all need to think of those relationships between tribes as transnational relationships. So I think it's a question of scale, and it kind of depends on like where, like the context and the project. So like if you're thinking about like the like with the example of thinking about uranium. There's a remembrance walk every year for the tailing mill spill, and it's definitely centered on Navajo experiences of uranium mining, but people come from all over the world really who feel like they share in kind of that story. So there's activists coming from Japan, there's downwinder communities coming from southern New Mexico where the bomb was first tested. And so I think that there's like this kind of a back and forth between the specific and then the relation.
Thank you. Yeah, I really actually look to Elspeth's work to address this question, and I think the Indigenous internationalism is key. And so to kind of to not quite answer your question, because I think Elspeth already answered it, I think I'm really interested also in Indigenous solidarity with third world decolonization movements in places that are not necessarily considered, only Indigenous nations, right? And I think I haven't actually really developed my analysis of that fully, although it's like an avenue I would like to pursue, taking inspiration from Elspeth's work. But something I have been thinking a lot about, so this is where I'm not answering your question, is Indigenous Asian solidarity. So I'm someone born and raised in Hawaii who is mixed race Asian and not Indigenous, and I'm really interested in kind of rethinking the model of anyone who's not Indigenous as a settler and thinking about the co-production of Indigenous dispossession and anti-Asian racism. And I think a really critical moment to look at that is World War II, particularly martial law, where there was this incarceration of Japanese people and dispossession of Indigenous people, as well as Japanese people, like as we see at Makua, right? Like both of those were happening together, and how they kind of propped each other up and bolstered each other. Kind of the anti-Asian fervor is what enabled the Indigenous dispossession, right? And then even the justification of the militarization of the Pacific and the militarization of Hawaii today is because of U.S.-China competition and seeing China as the biggest enemy threat. And even in Hawaii, when I do interviews with people, I'm working on a project on public attitudes towards U.S. militarism. So just interviewing whoever I can find, like at least 75% of the people I talk to is like, well, we need the U.S. military here to protect us from China, right? And whether or not China poses a veritable threat, there still is this anti-Chinese racism and yellow peril that's kind of indoctrinated so many of us. So if we can kind of punch through that, then I think that'll create even more openings for the return of Indigenous lands.
Hi, thank you both for your presentations. Really great to hear. And what I really reflected on was how important, of course, it often is to really communicate with people like frontline communities, and that's been my experience in mapping Indigenous spaces as well. But what's also been my experience is for accurately representing folks in policy making maps, in federal maps, in municipal maps, and state maps. So many of those maps pull in data where the data effectively has just been sterilized through trying to ensure numbers are anonymous, or simply people are actively choosing to not respond to census surveys and stuff because of the complex relationships with data collection. And it's always a running conversation in trying to ensure that policy maps represent Indigenous people correctly, health equity-based stuff represent correctly, so that change actually can happen, but it's just always imbalanced. So I was curious if you have any reflections on how to shift what is a standard pipeline for cartographers today in collecting data to consider how else we can make sure that representation exists, even if it's not in like census tract or something. Sorry, that might be a long question.
So this is a hard question, and I think like because I spend most of my time thinking about these like other kind of non-traditional spatial representations that I feel a little hesitant to respond. But I think like in my experience, some of the people doing the most interesting work around data sovereignty, but who are also very invested in having accurate data, is coming from things like the tribal epidemiology centers that are around the country. In Albuquerque, there was just a data sovereignty summit that was organized by folks working in kind of public health with Native nations in New Mexico. And I think like they are people who fully embrace kind of practicing data sovereignty and fleshing out what that means, but also want to collect accurate data that represents Native nations in the ways that they want to be represented. And I think one of the hard things is that historically with this type of data collection, even when we try to make it more culturally responsive, or there's a variety of phrases you could use, often there's just like a standard survey, and then there's like some questions tacked onto the end that maybe ask questions that are getting at the information that Native nations actually want to collect about themselves. And I think the real question is figuring out how can we might have to start from scratch actually to more accurately depict Native nations with our data.
Well, actually, yes, we'll keep this one. This is a fresh one.
Okay, cool.
I just want to say I couldn't forgive myself if I didn't use this as an opportunity to plug in tomorrow's session because it's going to be on data sovereignty, Native and Indigenous data sovereignty. That's not my question. I just wanted to put that out there for everybody. My question's for Laurel. So what originally attracted me to your work was that as somebody who's Cuban, born in Puerto Rico, this like constant, like drawing from each struggle in terms of U.S. militarism, because that's rampant in Puerto Rico and almost similar, and the government's involvement in overthrowing their original government. I was wondering, like, are you still seeing and making those connections in your work? Like, is the relationship between Puerto Rico and Hawaii still like alive? Are those scholars or those organizers still like drawing from each other, or have you seen like that relationship sort of go away? Because I was really surprised to see it even mentioned or just drawn on Leandra's diary.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. When I interview people who are part of these movements, they repeatedly invoke their experiences participating in delegations to Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, a lot of them have passed away, including Leandra, as well as another person who I spent a lot of time with and thinking about, who lived at Makua Beach as a child, which is, it was common at the time, before it was criminalized, and they're even considered homeless or houseless. So I do think those memories are slowly leaving with some of the people who are leaving us. But I know one of the key organizers, he has songs about Makua that were inspired by his trip to Puerto Rico, and he still sings it and plays it. I don't know exactly, I think he plays it on his ukulele, but in a style that's common to Puerto Rico. And he's still alive and active in the movement. So, even if it's through these songs, we still have some of the memories of that participation or that delegation to Puerto Rico that's still alive. I think it is also time to revive and revitalize those connections. So that is a project that I'm interested in pursuing, particularly because UT Austin has such strong Latin American studies programs. So I have a couple of colleagues that I'm like, so what about that Hawaii-Puerto Rico collaboration? So hopefully we can, get some sort of funding to bring organizers from Hawaii back to Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican organizers back to Hawaii. So I will work on it. And if you want to talk about it, we should talk about it.
Yeah, thank you both for your presentations. I have kind of a twofold question. Laurel, for you, I was just curious if the Makua community has any ties to historic Ahupua boundaries and that sense of community and how that works, because in a little bit of the research I've done, I've seen how, a lot of current people who are reviving that system talk about how it has to be collaborative management, just because so much of the state and military has come in and created these, broken up the land. And then to that end, for both of you, as cartographers, kind of talking about what Vanessa said, so much of, do you have examples of better representation visually of how we could represent indigenous communities, not falling into the Western cartographic conceit of drawing lines on maps that don't always accurately represent borders or communities, excuse me.
So I'll answer the first thing, you can answer the second. Okay, we'll split it up. So the ahupua'a is a Hawaiian land tenure system that divides the land. So, and the separations between each ahupua'a is the palena that I mentioned. And they're traditionally konohiki. Konohiki were basically, they're overseers or chiefs, and they ensured that the proper flow of water was running and that no one was diverting all of the water so that the people downstream couldn't get it. And so it was a way of collaborating and living together and ensuring that everyone has access to life-giving resources. And then what happened with colonialism, particularly with the arrival of plantations, is they just took all the water and monopolized it, and then choked out and dried out the agriculture that was practiced by indigenous people, or even Chinese people, living alongside Native Hawaiians who are growing taro and lo'i. Makua is an ahupua'a that has some other kind of smaller ahupua'a connected to it, but now it's all called Makua. And I think the vision for Makua as Makua University, a place of learning, is to restore sustainable indigenous land tenure systems, and ways to learn about the history of that and to recuperate that, including whether it's growing lo'i or sweet potato, or just in the indigenous agriculture, or just kind of learning the history of these systems, right? And I think the question of collaborative management is really, really important, because I think those are one of the key questions that we're going to come across with. We're not sure yet if the military will return that land, but I think if we are organized enough and raise enough awareness about this issue, we think it's pretty doable. But then after you turn the land, how is it going to be managed? Who is going to be managing it? And I think something that one of the former state officials that I know a lot of organizers have pushed up against, he's Native Hawaiian from that area. He was at one of the community public dialogues we organized in May, and he was like, you can't get around this question of land management. And even though land management is a colonial concept, I think it's important for us to acknowledge. So his ideas that I think we should be taken seriously is some form of a community land trust, where we have kind of mechanisms for shared governance, for conflict resolution. And I think it seems that everyone that has been working on this issue agrees upon is that the state of Hawaii should not be the primary land managers, because they will not do what needs to be done for the community. So I think for finding mechanisms and models for us to build upon is going to be really key, but taking some of the power away from the state of Hawaii.
Yeah, so your question was about kind of examples of better visual representations that aren't just within kind of Western cartographic forms. And yeah, I think that's my big interest. And there's lots of examples. And I think to center this, go back 20 years in nerdy map facts. There was a kind of international indigenous mapping conference that was organized, including by of a wide variety of people, including Jim Eno, who is sort of the initiator of the Zuni Map Art Project, and scholars like Muskogee Creek geographer Laura Harjo, and I was following along and was very intrigued. And I remember Indian Country Today had an article where they're new field emerges, indigenous geography, and I think that kind of moment generated a lot of really interesting scholarship that really started coming from kind of cartographers and people who are working in GIS, thinking about representing indigenous territories in a GIS, and kind of Renee Pulani-Lewis's question of what would an indigenous GIS look like. But I think coming from that there has been since then a lot more recognition of indigenous forms of representing landscape, and ways of wayfinding and things like that, that are not in a Western cartographic tradition. And so like a lot of scholars have written about, like forms of wood that have been carved to match a coastline, or, a huge variety of like visual representations of space. So I think there's a lot, both historical and contemporary. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm just going to finish here. We might cut a little after 12, but I just want to give some space for both of you to share anything. If there was a question that wasn't asked that you would have liked to have been asked, or something else you want to just share with everyone, or plug, feel free.
We're stumped. There doesn't have to be an answer to that.
Yeah, definitely do. Yeah, it's optional.
Well, if you want to go to Malama Makua's website, it's malamamakua.org, and we're going to try to keep people updated on our projects. Our most recent one was a Life After Occupation art exhibition that we held on September 28th, I think, just a couple weeks ago. I haven't actually been on the website, but there may be some announcements on the website, or possibly some of the art being shown. If you're ever in Hawaii, you can go to their website and you can sign up for a cultural access, which was part of a win from a 2001 lawsuit against the military. They have to let people onto the base a couple times a month. So that's another way so you can get more connected with this movement.